Hello, everyone. This is Christopher Perrin with The Christopher Perrin Show. And in this episode, I have the pleasure of talking to Heidi White. Some of you know Heidi because you've heard her speak at a conference, you've seen some of her things or writings online, or maybe you follow her on her Substack, which you might want to do after you've heard her talk. Or maybe you've heard about her recent book, The Divided Soul. I've known Heidi for several years now because we tend to follow some of the same circuits. In particular, the Circe conference every July, and heard her speak, talked to her, got to know her as a friend, and this book is just like so many of us who've been a part of this renewal of classical education. We start thinking, we start writing. And sometimes that writing turns into blogs. Sometimes it turns into our own teaching, if we are teachers, and many of us are. And then sometimes into a book. And, sometimes you don't really know what you think until you have had a good conversation with someone. And sometimes you don't know what you really think, or you discover what you think when you start writing. And so, Heidi, I wonder if that's been the case with you. I wonder if you could describe for our viewers and listeners what led you on this journey, first to classical ed generally, and then to the topic of this book.
Yeah, I really like the progression of that question, Chris, because that is exactly how it went for me. I got involved in classical education, homeschooling my own children, and through the discovery of the Circe Institute and some of the work that you do, also Martin Cawthorn over at Memoria Press, these relationships overlap, right, over the years. It's really beautiful to see personally and professionally. But anyway, as a homeschooling mother, I started reading the classics for myself. I had my, period of frustration that so many of us has, like, why didn't anybody tell me about these books and these ideas? And, I had drank so deep from a shallow well for so long, and then you discover that there is this rich heritage of this great tradition that is far deeper than any thought I'm capable of generating on my own. Thank God for that, right? We get to swim in these deep waters now. And so through redeeming my own education, which I think many of your listeners will resonate with, I got involved professionally in classical education, began to do some consulting and teaching and podcasting. And so if classical education is our vocation, right, I find myself with this little area of, worldly education, might call it specialization. I do not like that word, but like a special interest or love, enthusiasm for literature and the classics. And so I was doing the Close Reads podcast with a couple of colleagues, David Kern and Tim McIntosh at the time, and now Sean Johnson. And at the Close Reads podcast, we read books, we talk about books. And so I have had the privilege of being deeply immersed as a teacher, as a homeschooling mother, as a literary enthusiast, and as a podcaster, and reading what I believe to be the best books in the world, right? So anyway, my book, The Divided Soul, came from a conversation I had with a mutual friend with you, Chris, who's Andrew Kern. He's my godfather, and we were having a conversation about something. You know how it is with Andrew. Probably the cosmos, something very lofty and beautiful and rich and deep. And in an offhand way, not even related to the main topic of the conversation, Andrew said something to me like, along the lines of, well, Heidi, you know how everything in life comes down to the story of the prodigal son. And then he just moved on with the conversation. But immediately I resonated with that. I was like, I want to talk about that. Somehow to me that felt true immediately, but I didn't know why. I had this moment of like recognition of the truth of that. So I started thinking about the story of the prodigal son, which I know everybody who's listening and you are familiar with the story of the loving father with his two sons, and the younger son demands his share of the inheritance, and he goes out and squanders it on wild living until he finds himself hungry, and then he repents. He has a moment of repentance when it says that the story tells us the words of Christ say he came to himself. I love that phrase. I meditate, think about it all the time. So this young man comes to himself. He returns home. Father, I have sinned against heaven and earth. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. But he can't even get through his speech that he's practiced because his father runs out to meet him, welcomes him home, restores him to his former. He doesn't want to hear about him being a hired servant. This is his son, and he restores him to his inheritance by giving him this signet ring and putting a robe around his shoulders. And then he says, "We must kill the fatted calf and have a feast." But that's not the triumphant end of the story, right? There's another brother, the older brother, who has been toiling in the fields, doing his duty for all of these years, carrying resentment and judgment and self-righteousness in his heart. And he does not want to welcome his brother home. And so mimicking how the father mimics how he ran out to his younger son by leaving the house to go find out why the older brother will not come to the feast. The older brother accuses him, says, "You've never even given me so much as a young goat to celebrate with my friends. This son of yours," see how he displaces the relationship, right? "This son of yours has squandered his inheritance with prostitutes. Meanwhile, I've just been working for you this whole time." And the father tells him such loving words to comfort his anxiety. He says, "Son, you are always with me, and all I have is yours. But this brother of yours," restoring the relationship, right? "This brother of yours was dead and is alive, was lost and is found, and it is fitting that we celebrate and be glad." So I love this story so much because I agree with Andrew now. I think everything in life does come down to the story of the prodigal son. I started seeing this pattern in my own self, right? I have a prodigal and an older brother in me. I have this desiring part of my soul that wants on my own terms to fulfill every appetite I have immediately and in the moment in defiance and disregard of what is right and of the relationships and the love that compels me, right? And then I have this older brother in me that is self-righteous, that is judgmental, that demands what is due to me if I ever do anything that I could remotely construe as the right thing, and these two parts of my soul are in war with one another, but they shouldn't be. These are brothers; they're not enemies. And it takes the love of the Father and the communion feast of the fatted calf, with commentators across Christian history have always understood this to be an allegory of communion, right? The communion feast, and so that I did recognize, as Andrew said, this pattern in myself in pretty much every decision I ever make that requires a moral act of the will or a spiritual movement towards Christ or away. And so I wondered then if this pattern was recognizable in other stories of the people around me, the relationships around me, and then the stories that I was reading in the scripture, in the great books, and in literature. And I started seeing this pattern everywhere. And it was fun to identify it, but also so convicting and compelling. And so that began then kind of launched me off on the research, first of all, for my own healing. And then from it came so many conversations and opportunities to talk about it that seemed to resonate with people around me. I decided to write a book about it. So that's kind of the backstory of The Divided Soul.
Yeah, and that backstory seems to be like, from one grand perspective, the human story.
Yeah.
And so you found these incarnations in human reflection and artifacts over centuries. And as I said to you before, we started the camera, I've been thinking about the same thing from my rereading of Augustine's Confessions. So But, you go back to even Plato and the tripartite soul and, the galloping horses of, appetite, desire, reason. And how do we, this has just been seen. So it seems like maybe we see it in Genesis 1, when there's a different path offered and something that is pleasing to the eyes and to the mouth, and someone saying, has God really said? And offering a different perspective. So there's something universal about this that I think is remarkable. And as you were sharing that narrative, I was thinking like, the prodigal coming to his senses or coming to himself reminded me of something Chesterton said in this regard. He said, whatever else I am not myself. And that's just, isn't that when we're honest with ourselves, we perceive this disjunction, this inconsistency, this realization that we have an ideal that we really love and want, and yet something at war with that ideal within us. And so Augustine does this really well, doesn't he? And I know you've traced like 10 different books in your own book, but just to focus on Augustine for a minute, when he describes even as a boy his attraction to hang out with people who were doing rebellious things just for the fun of doing rebellious things, stealing pears that they didn't even need. He had plenty of pears and better pears, but he loved the stealing of the pears. And he even says in one place, I would lie about having done some of these rebellious things just so I could enjoy the pleasure of my friends thinking that I had done these things that I hadn't done. He wanted the reputation of being a rebel. And, where does that come from? So I wonder if you could take just that thought of our desire that lurks within us, that is even kind of a love of the unlovely.
Right.
And wanting to be known as a lover of the unlovely, as wanting to be known as a thief of pears, who steals pears even when you have plenty of them.
Yeah, the human soul is a mystery. I love that Chesterton quote. And I think you said something really, really important when you referenced Genesis chapter 1. That's the very first story. And so when I was doing the research for The Divided Soul, I wanted to know how far back this goes. It felt so universal, so fundamental, this conflict between duty and desire and our longing for them to be reunited. And so, of course, I went back to Genesis and looked at the very first story that we have, the story of creation and the fall. And when Adam and Eve were put into the garden, it was paradise. And God gave them 3 commands, right? Eat of every tree of the garden, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and take dominion over the entire created order. Those weren't permissions. They were commands. Do this. This is what you are here to do. This is the work that you are given. And that is paradise. So essentially their duty, the commandments that they were given, were to fulfill the desires of their heart, to eat, to multiply, and to take dominion. And so I started just pondering that and thinking about that. And I still do pretty much every day of my life. Because if you can imagine a world, Chris, in which everything you wanted to do, you should do. And everything you should do, you desired with all of your heart to do. There would be no conflict. If that were true, we would be completely at peace. We would be in paradise. And what the serpent does, you mentioned it just a few minutes ago, with the serpent as the monster who invades the garden, the sad part of the story. Every story has a sad part, right? This is the original sad, like the OG sad part of every story, is this moment of the monster invading paradise and deceiving Eve to break the commandment. Like it's one of those, like, you had one job, right? And the commandment not to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And even that commandment, if we take C.S. Lewis and so many other authors, including early church fathers, seriously, that commandment not to eat the fruit was always intended to be a safeguard of paradise, the preservation of desire and duty, the link to keep that union together, because the knowledge of good and evil breaks that, right? Unless it is given in its proper time. And so when Eve takes the fruit, like, she sinks her teeth into the fruit and she severs the link between the duty to God to keep this commandment and the desire to keep the commandments, right? All of the things that paradise does to fulfill those desires properly and rightly, but also exuberantly, with no end to the pleasure that would have been allowed to them if they had kept this commandment. They had fulfilled their duty. That breach between duty and desire, which happens in that moment, Eve, because she is deceived. And then First Timothy tells us unequivocally that Adam did it out of defiance. He was not deceived, says St. Paul. Adam was not deceived. And so we have one human who is deceived and another who is defiant. And so completing the fall in that way, fulfilling the measure of what it means to be fallen. And then the whole created order, the whole cosmic order falls along with it. And that moment of the division between duty and desire, is so traumatic, I argue in the book, that is the source of every human dilemma and every human problem we have. Every sin, suffering, and sickness goes back to that moment. And from that time on, those 3 commands that were originally given, eat of the fruit of any tree you like, right? Fulfill the desires of your eyes, whatever tree looks good to you, right? The desire of the eyes. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, the desires of the flesh. Right? Mm-hmm. And to take dominion over the created order, the boastful pride of life, right? These are the 3 core sins that come from the 3 core gifts. They're the inversion of them, right? And what we're told in the book of James, to resist the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride of life. And so I think to connect this with your kind of musings on St. Augustine and the Confessions, right? There is something in us that wants to play out the full measure of the fall, right? And because we do not understand the full glory of what it would mean to actually be unified between duty and desire. And that seems to me to be the whole pilgrimage of the Christian life. Like, and I'm thinking of Dante here, with Dante the Pilgrim on the top of Mount Purgatory, when Virgil crowns him Lord of himself and then tells him, because he's now been purged of the 7 sins, the 7 vices, and he tells him at the top of Mount Purgatory, now I crown and mitre you Lord of yourself. And then he gives him free reign of paradise and says, let your desire lead you, because no longer can you desire what is wrong. So for us, for Augustine and Confessions, for you, for me, for every human on earth, desire is dangerous. And because desire in itself is not actually pleasurable to feel. Like, desire is painful. Desire, says the poet Robert Haas, is full of endless distances. If you want something, it is only because you do not have it. And so that gap between the wanting and the fulfilling is so full of risk and danger. And there's certain personalities that just want to run into that and steal the pears. And then there's others who are like, I'm going back out to the field to toil so that I never have to deal with that, and I want to suppress it all of my days and then only demand what is due to me, and that older brother kind of urge. Like, that thing in us is the fall. And it's not because desire is wrong, it's because desire is so good and was intended to be attached to its proper object. And that then, if we can desire, if and when, through the pilgrimage of the Christian life, the life of Christ on earth, the life of the church, like, if we can recover and reunite desire with its proper object and then find that to be fulfilled, like that is joy. And that's what Augustine describes in Confession, from his misspent prodigal youth to the longing for God, right? How he opens up the Confessions. My heart is restless until it finds its rest in thee. He lets himself, after his conversion, remain a desiring man. And then through repentance and prayer and charity and love and service, he learns to attach that longing to its proper object, which is Christ and the life of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so lovely. So this reminds me of just the words that we use to describe these matters of desire, duty, and how they've, depending on your own community and experience and education, I suppose, you have different maybe connotations that come to mind when you hear a word like desire. So there's and the same thing. Now this makes me think of like the word eros, or the various words for love that we have in Greek and Latin. And eros is sometimes just thought of in terms of sexual terms, but it didn't only have that connotation. I think you might have read this book I'm thinking of called The Ethics of Beauty by Timothy Patistis, and he uses the language of chaste eros, that erotic desire is a desire to love the right thing in the right way, and then there is and it's like an arrow shooting out for something that it's seeking and wanting to have. And in Augustine, what you see, and you're kind of pointing this out, is you see particularly in the Confessions, he uses the language of the romantic poet to describe even God, because he's been transformed to love God as a lover. So there's a kind of chaste eros that you see in Augustine's writing, where he calls God his sweetness and his holy sweetness, and he calls him, that there's that famous phrase, that line, "Late have I loved thee, O beauty so ancient and new. Late have I loved thee." He turns to poetry to describe his love for God, and that to some, depending on your tradition and your education, it's kind of shocking, because we don't think that way. And then I'm just thinking of the word desire itself, because it's you may have come across this, and I'd love to hear your commentary on just how you respond to these words themselves and the way they've been used historically and presently. Desire is a word that refers to the stars, Siderum or Sidereus, meaning constellation of stars. So the way this in the the old ancient Latin, to hear the word desire is to make you think about what your experience is when you're looking at the stars in a dark night where there was no electricity. That kind of contemplative longing and wonder is a major connotation to their word. So it's already taking you to the heavens, if you will. In other words, there's something still calling us to the cosmic, kind of a cosmic love. Have you reflected just on the use of words in this regard? And what have you come up with?
Yeah, I for sure. I think one of the projects of a book like this, specifically in speaking of desires, you have to do as a Christian some kind of rehabilitation of even the concept of desire, right? Because desire is so dangerous, and all of us have been wounded because of an excess or wrongly ordered desires, or even deficiency of desire, right? Which is the vice of despondency and sloth, right? And so this, I think this question of desire is so important within the conversation. We all know what duty is for, right? Like, especially people who are like thoughtful, interested, intellectual people. We are trying to do the right thing. We're trying to understand what our duty is and live in that. And I'm not saying that's easy to do. It's not. It's not easy to do, but it's easy to understand. There's all kinds of disordered duties. and ways that we live that out. But I think just beginning with a conversation about desire, to your point, takes a bit of rehab or a repentance even in our own selves and our understanding of our desires and our experiences with them. You brought up Augustine. I'm thinking also of St. John Chrysostom, right? He says, like, he uses the word eros. He uses erotic language to describe his own love for God and the way that he urges his parish and those of us walking the Christian life to have an erotic love for God. He says, God is more ardent than any lover. And this, and so I started, thinking about what desire is for. Eros, you brought up that word, that is, the purpose of that is union, right? That's what we feel like when we feel erotic love. It's a desire for union with something, which is why it's so easily degraded into to sexual to sexual sins, right? But that's only the fallen part of eros. What eros is for a union in which keeps the self intact, right? And our most beautiful and compelling picture of that on earth is marriage, which is why the physical union is the erotic union of one man and one woman belongs within the context of marriage, right? Because it's only one part of the unity of two people, the union, that is the foundation of all meaningful human interaction within the family, and also within the monastic life, because that's just the erotic union of a chaste human with God, right? And so I really like what you said about desire and the stars, because it seems to me that first of all, let me back up and say, as you know, and many of our listeners also would recognize, Aristotle tells us to define our terms, right? And when we're speaking of terms, it seems to be important to talk about three questions about terms, like what is it, what does it do, and what is it for? And so the question of desire, like what is it, right? It's a gap, like it is a gap of something we want that manifests in longing for that thing. And what it does is it pains us until it is dealt with. Like that's what desire does. It troubles us and disorients us until we reckon with the desired object. And then what is it for? Right? That's the thing that I think many Christians cannot answer. Right? And so the response to that in our fallen self, if we do not know what it's for, it's either to become self-indulgent, right? The desire is there so that I can fulfill it with whatever I want, right? Or to deny it, which is what the older brother does, right? And indulgence and denial are not what desire is for. Desire is for joy. That's what it's for. That's why we have it. And sometimes that if we have a desire, we can immediately, like if I'm hungry, I can go get myself something to eat. However, if you are a kind of liturgical tradition, or a Christian that practices fasting, then even when, like right now we're in Lent, and so even when I am hungry, there's a limit to that desire, right? I can eat these certain foods during this time. Now, there's no fasting police. I don't have to. The only reason I do that is because I want something better, right? I will deny myself meat right now for the purpose of something I want more. That's what a sacrifice is. It's when you give up something you love for the sake of something you love more. And so then, and the reason I do that then is because Pascha is coming, Easter is coming, and then I will get to feast, right? So the purpose of the fast is the feast. The purpose of self-denial is eventually going to be fulfillment in the proper way. And that's where duty comes in, right? We get to desire. We're supposed to have big desires. That's why God gives us our human appetites, is for their fulfillment. But the fulfillment can only come through the keeping of the commandments, and that's the duty part, right? And so I like what you said about the stars, because instead of desire is not there just for self-indulgence, it's there for self-transcendence, so that we will long for the right things, so that then our desires will be tempered by duty in our human pilgrimage for the sake of the glory and the hope that is set before us.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. But what about this part of desire? Like, you can't put the stars in your pocket. You really can't fly to the stars. And, like Lewis in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, where he talks about these very things that you've mentioned, he says that joy is a human longing, a divine longing, greater than any human satisfaction. So that there's a sense in which, when you get to the feast and you enjoy it, there's still something missing. And, a lot of others, Aquinas talks about this as well. It's never fully complete. And so even when you're making that sacrifice for the joy, the greater joy, we're not there yet. There's still something receding before us. And I know you've contemplated that. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? And what is it that you want to say to students and teachers and others about that fact that it's never complete?
Right. Yeah. I think that's what Augustine and St. John Chrysostom, so many of the Christian, the truly alive, right? Is it that St. Irenaeus says, like, the glory of God is a human being fully alive, right? That the older brother in the parable, because that's true, because what you said is true, the older brother in the parable does everything he can to stifle his appetites, right? And one thing that Andrew said to me in that conversation about the prodigal son, the original conversation, and this didn't go in the book, but it's something I think about every day in my life. What he said to me was, the problem of Christian parents is that we keep trying to raise the older brother, but it's the prodigal that ends up reconciled to the father in the story. And I think about that every day, because that's true. God forgive me, right? I so believe in the moral and spiritual formation of my children, of the next generation, of my own self, right? And I've dedicated my life to that. But I cannot do it without having a desiring soul. And again, God forgive me, I have tried to suppress that in my children sometimes, because I'm afraid of that part of them. I'm afraid of that in all of us, right? And so I think your question is so apt. It's so relevant. What do we do with the fact that this side of eternity, we will always feel desire? Because, again, desire itself is painful. And so the older brother's solution to that is follow the rules and suppress desire. Don't want anything. And the reason he doesn't want to come to the feast is that he has spent so long denying that part of himself and shrinking the horizons of his life so that he only sees the work, the toil in the fields, right? And he puts off or suppresses or denies that he is a desiring being. But the reason the prodigal son comes to the feast is because that boy is hungry. He's always felt desire. And he's attached it to the improper object. He's feasted wrongly and done harm to himself. But his appetites are fully alive. So when he encounters the true feast, he's like, I want to go there. That's what I want, right? And I think that is, to your point, like the paradox of the Christian life, the harmony of the Christian life, and is the fact that we will always want something that we cannot have here. And that's why we walk by faith, not by sight. And we have to, in a sense, allow ourselves to feel an unfulfilled desire for heaven and that erotic desire for God. And the dissatisfaction of the world. Like, that's actually a good thing to feel, even though it's painful. And that is what we do, right? And I think about St. Paul in the book of Philippians when he says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. All I want is to go to heaven. All I want is to go be united with Christ. But because there is fruitful labor, because there's a duty for me here, because I have been given a work of apostleship, I know that I will stay on in the flesh, even though my longing is for heaven. And so I think what we do as Christians is we just live in the dutiful day-to-day life with our appetites fully alive to God, and we let that be painful, and we let that desire be transfigured by the life of Christ. And this is why the life of Christ takes so much attention and so much effort to walk in the obedience and the duty of it, while also not suppressing our longing and continually repenting and praying it will be attached to the right objects.
Yeah, I agree. To think about that phraseology of Lewis's again, a divine longing greater than any human satisfaction means that, given the fact that there is something wrong, we will live with something incomplete until it is made right. And of course, there's a Christian description and answer to that reality. But this does seem to be, whether you're, in the Christian faith or not, a reality. Humans die when they don't want to. They long for things they can't have. There's so much that is incomplete, and so many things that are truly broken and evil. People use that language. I just heard Bill Maher, the atheist, talk about evil in the world. They believe, even those who don't think there's any divine reality, that evil is real. And of course, those who deny that evil is real have another problem, and they're to be greatly feared. Nihilists.
Right.
So then I'm thinking about this. This is such a profound reality to live as a human being in a world that's broken, incomplete, and has evil in it, with desires that are unfulfilled. And even those of us in the Christian tradition are saying we never completely arrive in this life, but we have a hope that there will be, that divine longing will be fulfilled. And even our divine longing is much preferable than all the human satisfactions. So and this is just something for those of you outside of the Christian tradition, I think, to think about, because this is what the Christian tradition has always confessed. It doesn't confess a kind of triumphalism of having arrived and answered all the questions. It confesses Christ who is with us, who is present as an answer that does not give us all of the rational answers we might have. But he himself is a kind of answer, a response to our longings that we testify is true. But where I'd like to go in the time that we have now is to teaching and pedagogy. Because if these things are descriptions of the human condition, we have students who have desires, sometimes malformed desires, sometimes better formed desires, and duties. So I wonder, as you've tried to think through the implications of this reality, what practical implications have you come upon? And
Yeah.
when it comes to the way you teach at your hybrid classical school or your homeschool or in other contexts?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question because these ideas are they're so fundamentally true that it's hard to speak of them in any other way than universals, right? But it's such a good question to ask, like, well, then how shall we then live, right? What does this actually look like in, because the book is called The Divided Soul, but we don't want divided souls. Like, we want unified souls. Nobody is happy with division. So what we want is unity. What we want is to get to the point when everything we want to do, we should do, and everything we should do, we want to do. And again, this side of heaven, even on a very practical level, that's not going to happen completely or fully. But we can make progress. We can do. We can bring unity to these disparate parts, these two brothers within us, right? And I think on the pedagogy level, we do have to hold our students to the dutiful life. Like, there are assignments to complete. There's a way that we do think, a rhythm to the school day, whether you're a homeschooler or whether you're a classroom teacher, to be very thoughtful about what is a proper duty that I can inculcate within my students, condition them towards, and that, as Charlotte Mason so wisely has taught us, has so much to do with habits, like the daily habits of how we learn and how we treat one another, the expectations. If your kids are little, then it is like, when you finish, right before you come to eat, you wash your hands every single time, right? I mean, I just remember, and I'm sure you have the same experience, Chris, like when you have these little kids and they're like, every single day, like, do I really have to brush my teeth? And I'm like, yes, every day of your life, multiple times a day, right? And that's part of this, this development, this formation towards the dutiful life. I once had a priest say to me, one of the wisest things, and I've never forgotten it. He was speaking to a group of parents, and he said, if you want your children to be chaste, put them in piano lessons. And I love that, right? And of course, the principle behind what he was saying is, if you want your children to have this formation of rightly ordered habits towards the good, then you begin when they're small at things that are pretty low stakes, right? Daily habits that are the formation, the creation of something good, true, and beautiful. So for a child to have to sit down every day and practice their scales, right? And then eventually later they see that becomes Mozart's sonatas, right? That is exactly the same work that it takes to develop the moral virtue of chastity, which is that self-denial oriented towards the good. And the self-denial part and the habit part that's still creating something beautiful, that's the duty, right? And the desire is for what those habits are reaping in their lives. Lewis talks about this in The Weight of Glory in relation to Greek, right? And he talks about how when he was a young schoolboy, he didn't want to learn Greek, and it just felt like drudgery to him. But then later, when he was able to read Virgil and the classical authors in the original language, he was like, oh, now I see what all that was for, right? And so as educators and as parents, that's what we're doing, is those small daily habits that require something, that sacrifice, giving up something you love, your time, your freedom, your whatever, like in a small way, for the sake of something you love more. Doing your scales now for the sake of the sonatas, right? They don't know the joy of the sonatas yet, and it's our job to teach them those habits so that when they get there, it is like an awakening of desire and joy, of like, oh, thank you, Mom. Like, that's what's for. Now, that doesn't happen till later. And that's our work of duty as educators, right? How many times have we thrown up our hands and been like, does any of this work? Who cares if I do math today, right? Right, that. But that's our pilgrimage, right? That's what we do for their sake, for the sake of love. And all of this becomes unified in that in that beatific vision, that the blessed life that is. So in the mundane, ordinary work of life, it's exactly the same as those lofty ideas we were talking about. It's just a little kind of microcosm of these bigger ideas and this bigger vision of the Christian life that takes place at the breakfast table and at the read alouds and at the math and at the tantrums and all these things. Yes, we're going to church again this week. Yes, we're blah, blah, blah. Because that is the work. That is this kind of everyday, ordinary, mundane, quotidian microcosm of the larger salvation of the whole world.
It sounds like you're saying that it's possible that you can actually desire your duty. And that I wonder if the reverse is also true, that you can view it as a duty to desire.
Yeah.
Such that maybe these things become like just one side of the same coin. So I'm thinking like there's a place somewhere where Goethe paraphrases something like we should cease our endless striving to do what we want to do and love what must be done. But how do you help that, 8-year-old piano student to learn to love going to piano lessons? And when does that happen? Does it happen? Should we expect that it happens? Or do we have to say things like, you'll thank me later, just do it. It's your duty.
Yeah, kids love hearing that, right?
I think they do. I think they do blend at times. And an example I think that we all know of would be athletics. If there's a young junior high kid who really wants to be good at soccer, you'll find him doing drills in the backyard. Right. And he's doing this willingly. He wants to go out and he's saying things like, Mom, can I go now? I need to go practice this particular technique. I need to go. And of course, we love it when that happens from time to time. It is not always what happens. But I wonder if you could comment on that. What should teachers expect about this? And how do you handle this reality? Because we'd love for a child to say, Mom, can I do some more math? I really want to do, and expressing love and what used to be a duty. Does that happen? How, and if so, what should be our expectations about it?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it does. Like you said, there are those souls, our own, maybe. I would say that happened to me more as an adult, right? Like that now I look back on my childhood and I wish that I had taken piano lessons, although I probably would have complained about it if I had, right? I wish I had learned Latin. And so it wouldn't be such a struggle for me now. But this is part of the fallen world, the world that we are given, that is that we don't see those things until we are mature. And I don't know if we say things like, you'll thank me later, like someday that's, I don't like being told that. I'm 46. Now I think I can probably bear it with more patience. But our children, I think it's more just those daily habits of like, this is just what we do. We go to piano, right? And we do it because it is a good thing to do, right? And if they resist, and we have time, we have try again next week, right? Don't get discouraged. What we are trying to do in that is the skill of piano, because we believe it matters, right? We believe that they are cultivating something worthwhile and being able to unite duty and desire with with music, right? With harmony, and with skill. That's a beautiful thing in and of itself. But also as classical Christian homeschoolers, we are thinking about virtue formation as well. And one of the things that I noticed in my own life as a homeschool mom, my own, many long years of homeschooling my own children and educating other people's children, is that I am the one being formed, right? This is my education as well. If education is to draw up, right, it is in that moment of that frustration and that resistance from my child, right? In that moment, I too am being given a moral choice in how I respond and react. And if we want our children to be patient and to be temperate and to be just and all of these things, right, and courageous, we must model that to them, right? And so, yeah, I think you keep taking them to piano, but we're not doing it like the tiger mom, right? It's like, we're not demanding perfection. We're just saying, oh, this is what we do as a family. We go to piano, like you do your best, and we'll practice every day for 5-10 minutes. As they get older, they can do it more often, right? And just faithfully complete that work, cultivating our own virtue and modeling to them, right? If we will get off our phones, they will too, right? These are the things that we have to be thinking about in terms of our own relationship with duty and desire. What is the work I am given to do? It is to cultivate the lives and the hearts and the work of the hands of these students by faithfully contributing to these little habits, and in patience and virtue and wisdom for myself.
Yeah. So there's this, I love what you're saying about modeling, especially as the adults to the children or the teacher to the students, that maybe because we're more mature, we can desire our duty.
Yeah.
They can blend, they can be united, such that I can stand before a class to say, teach Latin or something, and be full of, eagerness and zeal to have them do academic work and to take them through some exercises and, things that you might call a duty. But there are times when the joy of something creeps up on you when you don't expect it, and I think, you mentioned like, what is desire for? Well, I'm thinking now, well, what is duty for? Duty is also for something good, to serve, to love your neighbor, these categories start to blend.
Yes.
Such that, especially oriented by love, a duty can be something that blends with desire and joy. So it's my duty to teach, but I love to teach. Or I'm thinking about Augustine when this is another place in his Catechism of the Uninstructed. He says that when a teacher is teaching a student something, the teacher teaching something he knows so well that it can almost be boring to him, not fresh. But the student who is receiving it for the first time mirrors back to the teacher freshness and liveliness and discovery that reawakens and re-enlivens the teacher, so that he says that the teacher and the student have their dwelling in one another, that the student speaks in the teacher, and they start to become one. Very similar to what I'm thinking by analogy, what you're saying about duty and desire. So even the teacher dutifully teaching something that is a duty for the student to learn can result in something joyful happening.
Right.
That just reminds me that these two things, perhaps in God's economy, they're not they're not completely separated.
Right.
They exist they already interpenetrate one another.
I think that's right.
So therefore, I'm wondering if there's the pedagogy of desire and duty that start to blend, where you, such that, you think of going through your Latin declensions or your Greek declensions, like Lewis was saying, like, is it pure duty? Like, you're not going to like this. I know you're not going to like it, but you're going to do it. And eventually you'll find some joy. But isn't it possible to teach the third declension in a way that students might enjoy it?
Yes.
And maybe is it possible for them to see that even if it's over the horizon, that one day you'll be reading the New Testament in its own tongue, and I'm going to get you there, and just keep following me. It's going to be great, and modeling the desire even while they're doing the duty. In other words, I guess what I'm wrestling with here is I wouldn't want these two categories to be so separate that students do think that one thing is going to be unenjoyable and the other thing will be.
Right.
Like they're antithetical. And
right.
then one other comment, and see where you go with this, is that I'm wondering if there isn't a parallel between the students doing their academic duty that's analogous to the discursive mind of reason. The ratio, the academic work that we have to do that takes focus and attention, and the contemplative work of the mind that is without work, which is intuition or intellectus, or contemplation. Right. That even in an academic exercise of doing the third declension, there might be moments of contemplation that break in, where you just stop and now you're thinking about something you didn't even know would come upon you, and it comes upon you maybe uninvited, and it's free, and it holds your attention and mind, and it blesses you, and you experience something like joy. And it happened in the midst of your duty. So I don't know that you can formulate it. You can't make that happen, but doesn't it happen sometimes?
It does happen. And I think that we as teachers, we have a responsibility to craft the habits of our classroom in order with room for that. You talk a lot about this. I have your book, The Good Teacher, and you give, and I've heard you speak on these things before. Also, I know that you have talked a lot about restful teaching, in your work at Classical Academic Press, and I've heard you speak on these things. And I think that those are kind of this practical scaffolding that that hold the potential for both of those experiences that you're talking about, like kind of that dutiful rigor that requires engagement with teacher and student. And then also the opportunity to pause and to reflect and to contemplate together. And I think one of the most helpful, and very practical ways of doing that is that concept that you talk about continually, Chris, which is multum non multa, right? Much, not many. And that in a classroom, like the idea of covering material has, in my opinion, no place in a classical pedagogy, right? I have books that we read in my classroom, but if we get to that contemplation that you're talking about, which I think Socratic discussion, especially with the great books, but even in the sciences and maths, that I really think that it belongs just as much there. And I could talk about that later, but I'm just going to pause, put that aside for a second, and talk about how Socratic discussion does that, right? So my students in my classroom, I teach high school, and right now I teach upper school, like 11th and 12th grade. And so these are kids in my classroom who have mostly been classical educated, with some exceptions. And and those students adjust actually really quickly, even if they're coming in at a later time in life. And we read some hard texts. Like we read right now, we're reading Rousseau's Social Contract. We're reading Kant in my early moderns class. We just read all of Paradise Lost. And so we're reading difficult texts that most students, if they're not classically taught, don't read them until college, or if at all. And we read in our medievals class, we read Augustine's City of God, not all of it. We read Boethius, we read Dante, right? and so I'm asking a lot of my students. And one of the rules in my class, well, one of the assignments in my classroom is that my students have to read and mark in their texts, right? So they get a book, I check their markings. I take their books every day and I make sure that they're marking and that they're being intentional. So I know that they're actually laying eyes on the text. And I try to cheat proof my assignments as much as I can, right? So, right now with AI, we know that that's like the rise of this. And so I actually have my students do most of their essay writing in class by hand, right? So I know that they're not using AI. So I think to myself, like, how can I assign work to my students that requires engagement for them so that even if they are cheating or trying to get away with it, they're actually doing something, right? Like, even if they're not reading as carefully, even if they're just opening up and underlining in order, and I don't think my students are doing that, maybe every once in a while, but I'm thinking like worst case scenario, right? Then I know that they were opening that book and underlining something from Dante got into their brain, right? And I have them summarize what they write. They have to do it by hand. All of their work is done by hand. They can't turn anything typed into my class. So all of these things to train their duty, right? I want them to have these dutiful habits, and it requires a lot of them. And usually they complain for a while, but then in my classroom, like, they're doing that at home. And then in my classroom, we're having Socratic discussion and conversation in which I'm taking their opinions seriously. These are 16, 17-year-old kids. They want to be taken seriously. They enjoy discussions that give them the freedom to talk, right? And so if we're having a conversation about Paradise Lost, then it's like, okay, today we're going to talk about freedom. What is freedom? What is free will? Let's draw from the text and let's have these conversations. And those get really fun and rowdy. And sometimes they're talking about, sometimes we're like laughing and making jokes. But that experience of like a meaningful engagement, you brought up the connection between teacher and student. I'm thinking of David Hicks and in Norms and Nobility, when he says divine eros, that word we used earlier, divine eros between teacher and students is the source of virtue in learning. That's a direct quote from the text. I think about that every day, right? I have to love these students. Like, I bond with them is the source of virtue in learning. So I need to create that, which means I need to be a teacher who is worth imitating, right? I need to, so that they can model the kind of learning and discussion that I do. And that means I have to work on myself and live in repentance, and follow my own duty, right? I actually do my homework I do all the homework along with the students every year. I do all the reading, underlining, and notebooking along with them. And then that means I need to actually listen to them, take them seriously, ask them questions, and form a meaningful bond with them. And I think that is that classroom uniting of duty and desire. You ask a lot of them, you require a lot of them, and you hold them accountable to it, but you also have a real bond of love and that takes them seriously as humans and enjoys them. And that's the work of teaching.
Yeah. That's lovely. Those examples, I think, are really concrete and helpful. So I'm thinking, the Latin word. I know you know this for duty is officium, and it's the idea that you have an office. You're a student. You're a parent. You're a farmer. You have an officium. But this is benevolent love for your neighbor. Right, to fulfill your duty, your office is the calling of love. So to read the book, to come to class, to prepare for the discussion is your offering of love to your teacher, to your students, and even to yourself, your future self, as well as your present. And then the desire the passion might strike. Like, it strikes me that one place, Augustine talking about the difference between, or it was Aquinas, between the life of the ratio and the life of the intellectus. He says that it is benevolent love for God requires us to do work. Benevolent love for our neighbor requires us to fulfill our duties. And there's all kinds of them that come at different stations of life. And then, but our love for God is what takes us into prayer and contemplation, where we experience contemplative knowledge and direct contact with reality through contemplation. And I think there's a rough analogy there to desire fulfilled. So another example came to my mind is, you assign the students to read Paradise Lost, right? And they're like, oh, this is work. But in the context of reading it, they come across something that startles them, like Satan saying it's, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. And then they're just thinking about that and its implications for life. And now something has been awakened that feels like a gift. Right, but you had to kind of concur with the habits that need to be developed and the assignments and so forth. Or another example comes to mind is back to your piano illustration. The little girl doing her scales, at some point, realizes she has a skill to create, and she starts creating her own little sonata after working on one of Mozart's simple sonatas, and she's filled with joy, and she's saying, "Mommy, listen to what I did." And so there's this. I think pedagogically, all these things do, as you were pointing out, they overlap and they blend. I guess I want to say that, and I'm sure this comes out in your book, that duty is not a dirty word.
Right.
Duty is something that we can also love to do, even though it comes with something that feels hard at times, and even though there are times when we will want to resist it. And even the teacher is coming into a classroom doing her duty, but it's a duty offered in love. And when students see that, it's modeling something that's very powerful. It just seems like the desires are a little more hard to predict, right? Like when the class comes alive and people forget that it's work. Any comments about that? Because it's like, we want that, we hope for that, we pray for that, we're trying to create conditions in which it occurs.
Right.
But it's not always absolutely predictable.
Yeah, I think that's surely true. But I think also you can trust that there's the artifact in the human. There's a reason why these artifacts still exist. There's a reason why we're still reading Pride and Prejudice, right? There's a reason why we're still reading the Odyssey. There's a reason why we're still learning Euclid, right? And it's because they are good, true, and beautiful in themselves. And because I am teaching students who have the image of God in them, I can trust, right, that that my job as a teacher is to be, in a sense, a guide or a mediator between the artifact and the student, right? And and so there's a duty to that, as you said. I love what you just said. There's an office of the teacher, and that is to create a meeting point between the student and the artifact, and to trust that the image of God in the student will respond to what the artifact is imaging. And so my job, because I teach literature and history, is to ask the right questions, right? So I think what you said about duty is really important. And I have the luxury and the privilege of being able to teach. The artifacts that I teach are models to my students in themselves. I'm not the only model there. The point, I'm in fact, I'm trying to get out of the way in a lot of ways. What I want them to see is the joy of duty in Jane Austen, right? And so that if I'm teaching Pride and Prejudice, so much of that story is a very simple kind of fairy tale, right? All Jane Austen stories are fairy tales, with a princess who has to suffer and endure, and then is rewarded for her virtue, with, a rich husband with 10,000 a year, or the breakup of her not so rich, I'm thinking of Sense and Sensibility, right? Eleanor gets the guy she always wanted. She's a duty-driven soul. She always does the right thing. The thing we want for all duty-driven protagonists is to receive a reward, right? And so that again goes to that question of duty and desire. And so if I'm asking the right questions about that text, like, what are the virtues of Elizabeth and like, why does she deserve to get what she wants? Those kinds of questions that are very relatable to teenagers. They all want to know how to get what they want, right? They all want to know, like all the girls want to know how to land Mr. Darcy. That's an interesting question to a teenager, right? And so my job is to create that environment so that those questions are uniting with the soul of the teen, with the artifact, right? And understanding that this is only the first time they'll read Pride and Prejudice. And so I don't have to exhaustively teach everything in this book. And I don't have to be like, well, what are the Regency dining laws? I don't want to miss that. Like, just leave that alone sometimes and just go to that which will unite the heart of the student with the text. I'm not just talking about student-led learning, but I'm talking about trusting that these students have an interesting life and relevant questions that these books can speak to. And I create those and forge those, the environment in which those bonds can be formed. And then trust that if I bring them to the feast, they will get what they need from it, which is another kind of Charlotte Mason idea, right? Bring them to the feast, they will take what they need, and then they'll come back, they'll have to eat again. And if they love Pride and Prejudice because of their experience in my class, they'll read it again when they're 25, they'll read it again when they're 35, they'll read it again when they're 45, and they'll get something more mature and that they need from it at that time. So I don't have the pressure to teach them every single tiny little thing. I'm not covering, but we're going much, not many. And I'm thinking continually about the souls of these students and the questions and the moral wrestlings and the spiritual development. And like, what is it that if I were 17, I would need from this book? And I can hone in on that, trusting that they can return to it.
I really am. I'm appreciating your using a Sense and Sensibility, or Pride and Prejudice is an example here of the merging of delight and desire. And I wonder if maybe to conclude, if you could choose another book that you cover in your book, The Divided Soul, that illustrates this. And I like the fact that you're also thinking about the teacher. You're thinking about pedagogy in your comments to me. Could you choose another one of your books and describe how you see this dance going on between duty and desire, and maybe make some comments about how you would teach it?
Yeah, I'd love to. I talk about, we're classical educators, right? And so we are interested in classical texts. So Homer's epics are an obvious example here, right? So the Odyssey, Odysseus and Penelope are both these harmonized icons of masculine duty and desire and feminine duty and desire. Odysseus is led, he does have a duty to return home. Like he must come home. And that's the purpose of the first four, but one of the purposes of the first four books, often called the Telemachy. We don't even meet Odysseus until book 5, because the first 4 books, often called the Telemachy, because they're about Telemachus, his son. They are, Odysseus is gone from home, and Telemachus and Penelope are in an impossible situation. Odysseus must return home. He has a duty to come home because his wife and his son and his kingdom are in danger. But Odysseus isn't trying to come home simply because he has a duty to his family. Odysseus wants to come home. It is desire that leads him home. In book 5, when we meet him, he is on an island with Calypso, the temptress goddess, right? Who's essentially keeping him as a pet, right? He's stuck there, and she makes him an offer, right? First of all, Hermes comes and tells her that she must let Odysseus go. The gods have decreed he needs to go home, and she has to let him go. And we find the first time we meet Odysseus, he is sitting on the beach looking towards Ithaca, weeping because of how much he misses home. Which if he had fallen desire, if his desires were not so pure, right? Why would he want to go home? He's on an island with this beautiful goddess. He has everything a man of the belly, a man of the appetites could want or need. But that's not what he wants. He has harmonized desires. He wants his home. He wants his land. He wants his wife and his son. He wants to go home and fulfill his duty to them. That is the longing of his heart, and he won't be distracted. And so Calypso wants to keep him, and so she makes him an offer. If you will stay with me, I will turn you immortal. And what he says to her is so beautiful. He says, Goddess, like, what is my wife Penelope compared to you? You're a goddess. She is immortal. She will age and die, and you never will. But nevertheless, he says, I long, I pine. Like his desire is attached to the proper object, and so he can endure all things because of that. And it is that desire which is unified with his duty to his land, to his wife, to his son, to the work of ruling, right? Makes him reject the lesser thing in favor of the truly human thing. Because he's a man and not a god, and he doesn't want to go above his station. He wants to be a man. And so he is, right? And then he has to endure all of these dangers and temptations, false homecomings, fight monsters, reject temptresses, right? All along the way, for him to be united to his wife. Meanwhile, Penelope is at home enduring sufferings of her own. And she does, the wicked suitors have moved in and are devouring their lands, violating duty left and right, fundamental Greek duties of hospitality and war, as well as just being jerks, right? And they want her to reject the memory of her husband. And she knows the man that she wants, right? She is in many ways like the church, right? This beautiful, and this is hundreds of years before the church, which tells you that the Lord is at work in all stories, right? But she is a bride who is stranded under, in the midst of dangers and temptations, but she will not neglect. She will. This goes to what we talked about earlier. She weeps every night, and that weeping and that longing is her virtue, right? It's her wifely virtue that she has endured grief for so long without forgetting. And that's what the church does. That's what we individual Christians do. We are stuck in our own land where we are the queen and the bride, right? But we're beset by endless dangers and temptations, and we continue to do our duty, but we never forget what we truly want, which is the return of the Lord and the King to union with us and the restoration of the land. And that is the Christian life. So the Odyssey it's a complicated book, and there's many ways to read it, but that beautiful kind of allegory of unified duty and desire is, I think, one of the most beautiful ways, and one of the ways I teach it in my classroom. I don't remember where.
Keep going.
Did you get it all? Okay. What was the last thing you heard me say?
You were saying that Penelope waiting is similar to the church waiting
Right.
for the return of Christ.
Yeah, so Penelope, hold on. Penelope's experience of suffering in her own land, where she is the queen and the bride, and she's beset by these demonic dangers and temptations as represented by the suitors. And it is her work, her office, right, as wife, to wait faithfully and to suffer, right? And this goes to what you and I talked about earlier, Chris, that it is part of the Christian journey is to suffer in the waiting for the return of our Lord and our King, and to endure that without forgetting. Like Penelope is praised in the Odyssey because she does not forget her husband. And so in that sense, then, she is this example of femininity and of Christian virtue to us today. And so the Odyssey is a complicated book, and you can read it a multitude of ways. But this is, I think, one of the most beneficial and edifying ways to read this book as this icon, right, of harmonized duty and desire, in which desire leads and duty follows, and duty upholds and becomes this scaffolding for rightly ordered desire. And then in the end, when Penelope and Odysseus are reunited, it is in a conversation about their marital bed, right, in which Odysseus places a test before Penelope. I'll if you move the bed out, I'll sleep on this. And she's like, you can't move this bed. It's anchored with this tree, this like deeply rooted tree at the heart of the kingdom, which is this beautiful symbol for marriage and marital union, which again goes to what desire, what eros is for union, right? Ithaca, the land, and Penelope and Odysseus individually, and then Telemachus, none of them are okay without the union of the king and queen in their marital bed, which cannot be moved. It is anchored at the heart of the kingdom. And that becomes then this picture, this icon, this analogy of the Christian life to us today. And again, there's more ways to read the Odyssey, and those are perfectly fine, right? But I think that one is a really beautiful way to read it and to think about it, and to teach it. That's how I teach it in my class.
Thank you for that. This could open up another hour-long conversation. We should probably refrain from having, but yeah, I'm glad to hear that, and also yes. The Odyssey is, like any great work of art, multidimensional. I'm thinking about why did Odysseus chase the smoke and go spend time with Circe? Not needed. Why tie yourself to the mast and listen to the sirens? Not needed. Distraction. You say you desire to get home to Penelope, and yet you're chasing smoke on the next island, or the issue with Cyclops. But that also illustrates our own temptations to be distracted from what we really want, and it illustrates your point about the divided soul, that we resist our own desires at times. We're conflicted. Romans 7, I do the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things I want to do. Well, thank you, Heidi, for this great conversation. Could you let our listeners and viewers know where they can get your book?
Yeah, you can buy it at www.goldberrypress.com. That's my publisher. As far as I know, it's not available on Amazon right now, unless we have third-party distributors out there. We're trying to stay out of the machine as much as we can and keep the sales of this as human and as connected as we can. And so It's also available in many local bookstores around the country, so you might be able to pick up a physical copy if you have an independent bookstore near you. But your safest bet is goldberrypress.com. And it's been such a joy. So I love to hear comments and feedback and arguments, anything. I have a literature podcast in which we just like talk about books and debate ideas. And so I'd love to hear your feedback. I'm easy to connect with over messaging on Substack or on Instagram.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for this great conversation. And once again, I too ordered the book from goldberrypress.com. Encourage you to do the same thing. Heidi also runs a Substack. What's the name of your Substack?
Heidi White. It's just look me up, or you can go to Close Reads if you want to follow along with the podcast and my work over there.
Great. Close Reads podcast or the Heidi White Substack. Thanks once again for being with us, Heidi, and thank you, kind listener or viewer, for being with the Christopher Perrin Show today. Have a great day.
True North.